We now take a look at what was happening with the Beatles in the period between about 1960 and 1962 in Hamburg and in Liverpool. And if you want, you can think about these as the years of the Beatles' professional training. This is how they came from being amateurs playing around Liverpool, where, by the way, the Liverpool scene was extremely active. There were lots and lots of groups around Liverpool, but almost all of them were kind of amateur groups in a certain sense. People had day jobs and then they played in these bands. But there were tons and tons. So they were living in an environment where there was a lot of bands and a lot of music going on, a lot of clubs, a lot of venues, a lot of things going on. And so it was a very, very rich environment. Even though it wasn't London, in many ways it was a very, very rich environment, one that's very conducive to young musicians learning about music. But at some point you've got to really sort of hone your craft. And so they ended up going off to Hamburg, and how that happened is kind of an interesting part of the story, and the way it happened, I think, tells us an awful lot. We don't often think about what was pop music like in West Germany in the period of the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And there was a lot going on with popular music there, as one might expect, although maybe not think about it a whole lot. And one of the styles that was sort of hitting big, again, kind of maybe in imitation of the success of Elvis Presley, was a style called Schlager. And some of the important figures in that Schlager scene were a fellow by the name of Freddie Quinn, another by the name of Tommy Kent, and one by the name of Ted Harold, who has the distinction of being dubbed Germany's Elvis Presley. So there was a kind of German version of American pop music, American rock and roll that was happening there. And so that a little bit explains why in Hamburg they would have been interested in having this kind of music in the clubs, and why they might have been drawn from it. An important figure for us to keep in mind is a fellow by the name of Bert Kaempfert. He was kind of West Germany's answer to Herb Alpert. He was a trumpet player who was very involved in production, had hit records in Germany, even had a U.S. #1 hit in 1961. Remember, we talked about Lonnie Donegan having a hit in 1956 in the U.S. He had a #1 hit called Wonderland by Night, which was kind of a trumpety, sort of a trumpet melody kind of piece. So Bert Kaempfert, very important. He's the one who's responsible for the Beatles doing their first recording with Tony Sheridan. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But Bert Kaempfert, a mover and shaker in this pop scene in West Germany in the late 50s and the early 1960s. Another person that we can spend a minute talking about is Bruno Koschmider. Bruno Koschmider was a guy who owned the first club that the Beatles played in Hamburg, the Indra. He also owned a place called the Kaiser Keller, and a couple of other places, a coffee shop and a movie theater called the Bambi Kino, which is actually where the Beatles ended up staying. They sort of had a room kind of behind the screen and you know, washed up in the theater restroom. But the way that the story is often told, at least by Alan Williams, is you recall that Alan Williams and Lord Woodbine decided to take a trip to Hamburg to find out about getting gigs for Lord Woodbine's steel band. So Alan Williams recorded a bunch of his had recorded a bunch of his groups on a reel-to-reel recorder. He thought, well, if we can get gigs I won't get gigs just for the steel band, I'll get a whole bunch of my different groups. And so he finally, they're walking around Hamburg trying to find the place that might be best for you know, what these sailors might have been talking about, and they hear some rock and roll, you know, in German, sort of coming out of one of these clubs, and they go in and they meet this guy, Bruno Koschmider, and he says, well, you know, I have some acts from Liverpool to do popular music, rock music, steel band, this kind of thing. Would you be interested in hearing them? Koschmider says, that sounds fantastic. So Alan Williams pulls out the little portable player, and he starts to play the tape, and by some accident, the entire tape was erased. So he got nothing but shh, you know, on the whole tape. Well, he thought, I've totally bungled this. He sort of went out with his tail between his legs. Opportunity missed, all this kind of thing. Back to Liverpool they go, nothing happens. In the interim, Koschmider goes to London trying to find Alan Williams to see if he can book the groups. He doesn't really understand the difference between Liverpool and London, or didn't quite understand it, or in the English or the translation or whatever. Ends up going to the Two Eyes coffee bar, which is where a lot of the late 50s, early 60s stars were sort of discovered. It was one of the happening kind of venues, and meets up with a fellow by the name of Tony Sheridan, who had worked for Larry Parnes, but not so much gotten along with Larry Parnes. Sheridan goes to Hamburg and really becomes kind of the big man man on the scene in Hamburg. The place where these clubs were located is in the St. Pauli district on the Reeperbahn. Hamburg was a city at the time that had legalized prostitution, and a lot of drugs were available, and so it was kind of in many ways the sin city of Europe. And so the clubs were kind of always open and lots of music and all this kind of thing. And so they needed groups, and they liked American rock and roll. And Tony Sheridan seemed pretty American, at least by German standards. And so eventually, Alan Williams and Bruno Koschmider are able to connect and find one another, and Alan Williams starts sending acts over from Liverpool, and the Beatles are one of those acts. Now, I mention Tony Sheridan because Tony Sheridan ends up being a very important influence of the Beatles, and on the Beatles, and a lot of times that influence is overlooked. He was a very accomplished guitarist, and word is among many people who were there that George Harrison would take every opportunity he had to watch Tony Sheridan playing the guitar and learn everything that he could from him. Tony Sheridan was a few years older, he'd actually sort of worked with Larry Parnes, this kind of thing, so he was the big guy. And many times the Beatles would sort of back him up, and that's how they ended up on that first recording that they did, My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, the one that in many ways is sort of the thread that begins the whole story of Brian Epstein and the Beatles' rise to fame in 1963. So let's look at a little bit of what was happening with the Beatles' Hamburg stints. We'll see the dates and the times in which the Beatles were actually in Hamburg. Their first stint was August through November of 1960. So here they are in Germany. John Lennon is 20, Paul McCartney's 18, George Harrison is 17, underage, and that leads to him being thrown out of the country at the end of the engagement. Anyway, they play the Indra and the Kaiserkeller at the end of 1960. Pete Best is on drums, Stu Sutcliffe is on bass at this time. They go back in April through July of 1961 and play the top 10. They record My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean with Tony Sheridan in August of 1961. They couldn't call the group Tony Sheridan and the Beatles because in the Hamburg dialect, the word Beatles sounds like the word Beatles, and the word Beatles means penises. So essentially it would have been Tony Sheridan and his penises, and that wouldn't work. And so they released it as Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. That was released in August of 1961. They went back April through May of 1962 and played the Star Club. That was sort of the big club in town. Even in November of 1962, when they were starting to have some real success in the UK, or at least more notable success, they did 14 dates at the Star Club, and then went back in December of 62 and did 13 dates at the Star Club. How do we know what the Beatles would have sounded like back during those years? Well, one way that we can tell is because we have the cover versions of a lot of songs they would have done in their Hamburg and Liverpool acts on the first couple of records. But in addition to that, the Live at the BBC recordings have got tons and tons of cover versions they did for the BBC that never appeared on any of their regular albums. And if you look at one of these books, like for example the Bill Harry book or some of the other books that deal with the Beatles' sort of day-to-day activities, they were so busy that when they did those BBC recordings, there was really no time for them to work up a new arrangement. So they basically did the arrangements they'd done previously, and so it gives us a pretty good idea of what those arrangements would have been like. What we know is that the Beatles did very close cover versions of the records they covered. They didn't just get the song, the chords, the lyrics, the melody, and do their own thing with it. They really tried to duplicate the record. If you go to Live at the BBC and find the version of the Beatles doing That's All Right Mama, you could probably convince most Elvis fans that that's an outtake of Elvis doing that song. They not only do they do the song note for note, but Paul McCartney does the Elvis voice, everything. Why is that important? It's important because as young songwriters, we want to know, what did John, Paul, and George know? What music were they had they studied carefully? If you were a young classical composer, you would study the music of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and Schoenberg and Stravinsky and Boulez, and that would help inform your own technique. And the argument I want to make is that the Beatles doing all these cover versions assimilated a lot of the characteristics of American pop, and that's what ends up in their early music. Those Hamburg gigs were merciless in terms of the hours. Lots of times they'd be doing 6 sets a night, sometimes interspersed with another group, so they'd play for an hour, be off for an hour, play for an hour, be off off for an hour. I mean, it was just brutal. In fact, they started to use amphetamines, diet tablets to sort of, as uppers, to sort of keep their energy up. And what happens when you a young musician, you get into that situation where you have to play so much for so long, you either quit or you get good. And what happened with the Beatles is they got really good. They were still rugged and rough. In many ways, they were still wearing sort of leather jackets, and they hadn't really sort of turned into the sort of mop tops that we'll think of when we think of the early Beatles. But still, they were sounding really good, so that when they came back to Liverpool to do gigs after having done a couple of stints in Hamburg, all of a sudden people were like, "Oh, these guys, something has really changed. They're really great." So let's move on to their time in Liverpool, and most importantly, what they were doing, the gigs they were doing at the Cavern Club, which is usually associated with the Beatles, growing success in Liverpool. Though they did a lot of other gigs, sometimes 2 gigs a day, even 3 gigs a day, sort of bouncing around, remembering that the set maybe would be 30 minutes long or something like that. But the Beatles were very, very active around Liverpool, but we tend to focus on the Cavern Club because they had a regular gig there and they were maybe most synonymous with that particular gig. As I mentioned earlier, the Beatles were not the only musicians or entertainers from Liverpool to have success in the UK, although often the fact they're from Liverpool, a lot is made of that. But others like Frankie Vaughan, Alita Rosa, Michael Holliday, we already talked about Billy Fury and Johnny Gentle, all came from Liverpool. Maybe what was a little bit different about the Beatles is they didn't try to hide their northernness. They didn't try to hide their accents. They didn't try to act like they could be mistaken as somebody coming from London. They were very much Liverpudlians in terms of the ways they presented themselves. So that's maybe why the Liverpool label sort of really sticks with them, and why a lot of people thought that the Mersey beat was essentially a northern thing, that it was a regional kind of thing, because it was associated with the north, because you could tell that's where these guys came from. They weren't trying to hide it. If we look at a Liverpool timeline, we can see that in February of 1961, the Beatles do their first gig at the Cavern Club. By February of 1961, they've already done that first stint in Hamburg, the one where George gets kicked out of the country. In November of 1961, Brian Epstein sees the Beatles for the first time at the Cavern Club. He signs the band in January of 1962, gets him an audition at Decca Records. We'll talk about that a little bit later. In March of 1962, the Beatles make their first appearance on the BBC. Unfortunately, in April of 1962, Stu Sutcliffe dies. He doesn't come back with the Beatles when they come back from one of their Hamburg trips, but gets married to Astrid, and unfortunately dies of a brain hemorrhage or some kind of a head thing like that. In May of 1962, Brian Epstein meets George Martin for the first time. So that timeline gives us a sense of what's happening. Of course, when Epstein meets George Martin, that's the beginning of the Beatles really moving out of their Liverpool environment and toward London. Let's take just a minute at the end of this particular lecture to talk a little bit about Brian Epstein. We talked before about how he was an important person, and we'll check back in with Brian a couple times over the next few weeks to see how things are going with his career in parallel to the Beatles. Brian Epstein, of course, the manager of the Beatles, older than the guys by probably maybe 10 or 13 years, but still very friendly with them in a way that wasn't as distant as the relationship with George Martin, say. Brian Epstein came from, by the way, the pronunciation of his name, he preferred Brian Epstein. And would correct people early on when they said Epstein, but then he just got tired of it. And so everybody sort of knows him as Epstein, although he would have preferred the pronunciation Epstein, according to people who knew him back in the Liverpool days. I may go back and forth between those pronunciations, don't let that throw you. Anyway, born into a relatively well-off family that owned furniture stores in the Liverpool area, had trouble at school, flunked out of a lot, or got kicked out of a bunch of schools as he was growing up. His family wanted him to go into the family business. What he really wanted to go into was dress design. And there are sketchbooks where you can see some of the designs that he did. So very artistic, really, from the very beginning. He spent some time at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, so a guy who contemplated at least a career in the theater. This, of course, would inform his ability to present the Beatles in a more sort of professional and and polished kind of way. He gets involved in the pop scene in the early 1960s in Liverpool. He opens a record department inside the furniture store. Remember, back in those days, if you bought a record, you maybe bought it from the same place you bought the record player from, and a record player back in those days was a big piece of furniture. So the record department was something that Brian, because he'd been interested in the arts, could really get into, and he got into it in a big way. He opened this department called Nem's Record Store, and in Nem's, North End Music Store, that's what the NEMS stood for, owned by his family, but he sort of ran it. He was able to get a stock, a way of controlling his stock and his inventory that allowed him to know exactly how many records he had of everything. It was really pretty ingenious. He was very good at it. As he was doing that, he was also writing columns for a magazine started by Bill Harry, another art school friend of John Lennon's, in July of 1961. This magazine, or this newspaper, was called the Mersey Beat, and the Mersey Beat is very important in chronicling the early days of a lot of these Liverpool groups and the Beatles as well. Anyway, what happens with Brian Epstein is fans, when the Beatles come back from Hamburg and they've recorded My Bonnie with Tony Sheridan, they start telling people that we recorded a record when we were in Germany and all this kind of thing. And so people start coming in asking, they want My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean by the Beatles. And he's looking through all of his catalogs with all of his distributors. He cannot find this record anywhere. And being the kind of guy he was, fastidious about having everything for his customers, he just left no stone unturned until he finally figured out that it wasn't a domestic release at all. It had been released in Germany. And so he was able to get copies of the record, and he bought more than the people who he was working with thought he should. They thought, why are you buying all these records? Well, they sold out almost instantaneously because the Beatles were so popular in Liverpool. And so the idea was, well, maybe I should go see these guys and check them out at the Cavern Club. And so, in fact, he goes down to the Cavern Club, he sees the Beatles, and starts his campaign to get the Beatles to sort of be his make him their manager. And so this is the way the whole thing starts. We started with Tony Sheridan and Bert Kaempfert, Bruno Kashmir in Hamburg, ends up being a record that Brian Epstein finds. He decides, background in theater and arts and this kind of thing, that he's going to manage a young group. And here we have all of this coming together in 1961, 1962 for the Beatles. So in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the Beatles' first recordings for Parlophone. They go into the studio and start to record the music that we all know.